He stared at the notification on his phone, his coffee growing cold in the ceramic mug Sarah had bought him 3 years ago. The same mug he couldn't bring himself to throw away, even though she'd been gone for 18 months now. The message was simple, direct, devastating in its casual cruelty. I found someone else, someone who understands me better. Don't contact me again. Below it, a photo that made his blood freeze. A young man, maybe 25, maybe 30 at most, with his arm around Lila's waist. The same waist he had held just 48 hours ago. If you're watching this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel because what you're about to hear will shake you to your core. This is a tale of manipulation, betrayal, and the dangerous lies we tell ourselves about love. Robert Matthews had thought he understood women. After 26 years of marriage to Sarah, he believed he knew the rhythms of love, the ebb and flow of partnership, the quiet comfort of shared silence. But grief changes a man, strips away the certainties he once held dear, leaves him vulnerable to predators who wear the mask of affection. At 54, with greying temples and laugh lines earned through decades of genuine happiness, Robert had never imagined he would become prey. The dating app had seemed harmless enough. His daughter Emma had insisted, her voice gentle but firm during one of their Sunday phone calls, "Dad, you can't live like a monk forever. Mum wouldn't want that." The words stung because they were true. Sarah had made him promise in those final weeks when the cancer had stolen her voice but not her fierce determination that he would find happiness again. "Promise me you'll live, Robert. Really live." So he had downloaded the app, created a profile that felt like writing his own obituary, posted photos that made him look older than his years. He expected nothing. He received everything he never knew he wanted, wrapped in lies so beautiful they felt like truth. Lila's message had appeared on a Tuesday evening in March, when the Seattle rain drummed against his apartment windows like impatient fingers. Her profile photo showed a woman with glossy black hair and eyes that seemed to hold secrets, 32 years old from the Philippines working as a nurse in Vancouver. "I prefer mature men," her bio had read. "They know what they want and how to treat a woman right." Robert Matthew had not always been a lonely man. Before Sarah's death, before the empty apartment that echoed with phantom footsteps, before the king-size bed that felt like an ocean of solitude, he had been a successful architect with a firm he had built from nothing. His hands had designed homes for hundreds of families, had drawn blueprints for dreams made manifest in steel and stone. But now those same hands trembled as he typed responses to a woman half his age, half a world away. The grief had taken everything from him except his heartbeat. In the months after Sarah's funeral, he had tried to return to work, to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of creation and problem-solving. But inspiration had abandoned him like a fair-weather friend. His designs became sterile, functional, but soulless. His partner of 15 years, David, had finally pulled him aside in September. "Take a sabbatical, Rob. The firm can handle things. You need to heal." Healing felt impossible when every corner of his life contained echoes of what he had lost. The coffee shop where he and Sarah had their first date. The hiking trail where they had scattered her mother's ashes. The grocery store where they had argued about organic vegetables just 3 days before her diagnosis. Seattle had become a museum of memories, each familiar sight a fresh wound. His daughter Emma lived in Portland now, busy with her own life, her own family. She called dutifully every Sunday, her voice carefully cheerful, but Robert could hear the concern beneath her words. His son Michael was stationed in Germany with the army, half a world away, and struggling with his own demons. The family that had once been his anchor had scattered like dandelion seeds in the wind, each carried by their own grief to distant shores. The apartment overlooking Elliott Bay had been Sarah's choice, their dream home purchased 5 years ago when retirement seemed like a distant country they would explore together. Now it felt like a prison with $1 million view. He had thought about selling, about starting fresh somewhere new, but the paralysis of loss had rooted him in place. Where would he go? What would he do? Who would he become without the identity that marriage had given him? That's when Lila's message had arrived, like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Her words were careful, respectful, tinged with an exotic accent that came through even in text. She had read his profile, she said, and was impressed by his honesty about his loss. "I know what it means to grieve," she had written. "I lost my father when I was 25. The pain never leaves, but it can transform into something beautiful if you let it." Lila Santos presented herself as an angel wrapped in digital silk, her profile a carefully curated portrait of perfection. She was a registered nurse at Vancouver General Hospital, she claimed, working the night shift to care for elderly patients. Her photos showed a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a smile that seemed to reach through the screen and touch something Robert thought had died with Sarah. She spoke of family values, of respect for elders, of the loneliness that came with being far from home. Their first conversation lasted 4 hours, stretching deep into the night as Robert found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone since Sarah's death. Lila listened with apparent rapt attention, asking thoughtful questions about his work, his children, his dreams for the future. She shared her own story in return, painting herself as a dutiful daughter who had moved to Canada to support her aging mother back in Manila. Every paycheck, she said, she sent half home to help with medical bills and living expenses. "I have always been attracted to older men," she confessed during their third call, her voice soft and vulnerable in the darkness of his apartment. "They have wisdom that younger men lack. They know how to cherish a woman, how to make her feel safe and valued. My friends think I'm crazy, but the heart wants what the heart wants." The words were like medicine to Robert's wounded soul. After 18 months of feeling invisible, of catching glimpses of himself in store windows and seeing only a ghost of the man he had been, Lila made him feel vital again, desirable, necessary. She asked for his opinions on everything from her work schedule to her choice of movies. She sent him photos of her meals, her commute, her small apartment with its single window overlooking a busy street. Their relationship progressed with the intensity of teenagers and the supposed wisdom of adults. Video calls replaced phone calls, and Robert found himself counting the hours until he would see her face on his screen. She was beautiful in a way that took his breath away, with delicate features and expressions that seemed to mirror his own emotions. When he spoke of Sarah, Lila's eyes filled with tears. When he shared his fears about growing old alone, she reached toward the camera as if trying to touch his cheek. But there were inconsistencies, tiny fractures in the perfect image she presented. Sometimes she claimed to be at the hospital when her background clearly showed her apartment. Her stories about co-workers had a rehearsed quality, lacking the spontaneous details that made real experiences memorable. When he suggested visiting her in Vancouver, just a 3-hour drive from Seattle, she always had reasons why the timing wasn't right. The hospital was short-staffed. Her visa status was complicated. Her mother was having a crisis back home. Robert ignored these red flags because he wanted to believe, because loneliness had made him desperate in ways he didn't want to acknowledge, because the alternative, returning to the empty apartment and the echoing silence, felt like choosing death over life. The courtship unfolded like a fever dream, intense and consuming and slightly unreal. Within 6 weeks of their first message, Robert and Lila were talking every day, sometimes for hours at a time. She had a way of making him feel like the centre of her universe, as if his happiness was her only concern. When he mentioned feeling tired, she would research natural remedies and send him detailed health advice. When he shared his struggles with returning to work, she would offer encouragement wrapped in admiration for his strength and resilience. But the first trickle of financial requests began so subtly that Robert almost didn't notice. Lila mentioned that her phone bill was overdue, threatening their ability to communicate. The amount was small, less than $200, and she was embarrassed to even mention it. Of course, Robert offered to help. What was $200 compared to the joy she brought to his days? She protested, claimed she couldn't accept charity, but eventually agreed when he framed it as an investment in their relationship. The requests became more frequent but remained reasonable. A car repair that would help her get to work safely. A medical bill for her mother that had come due early. Groceries to get her through until payday. Each time, Lila expressed genuine reluctance to ask, genuine gratitude for his help. She sent photos of the receipts, proof that his money was being used as intended. She talked about how she would pay him back once her financial situation stabilised, how she hated being dependent on anyone. Robert found himself looking forward to these opportunities to help. They made him feel useful, needed, important in her life in a concrete way. After months of feeling powerless against grief, against time, against the inexorable march toward an uncertain future, he could take action. He could solve problems. He could be her hero. The emotional manipulation was so skillful that Robert didn't recognise it as manipulation at all. Lila began sharing more intimate details of her past, stories of ex-boyfriends who had taken advantage of her generous nature, of family members who expected her to sacrifice her own happiness for theirs. She painted herself as a woman who had been hurt too many times but was brave enough to love again. She made Robert feel like her salvation, the good man who would finally treat her as she deserved. Their conversations took on an increasingly romantic tone. Lila began calling him her king, claiming that she had never felt so connected to another person. She spoke of their future together with a certainty that made Robert's heart race. She would move to Seattle once her work visa situation was resolved. They would travel together, explore the world that had seemed closed to him since Sarah's death. She would take care of him as he grew older, be his companion and lover and best friend. The sexual component of their relationship developed gradually, naturally, through late-night conversations that turned intimate. Lila shared photos that grew increasingly personal, videos that made Robert feel desired in ways he had almost forgotten. She made him feel virile and attractive despite the grey in his hair and the softness around his middle. Their virtual intimacy felt real because his emotional investment was real, but the requests for money kept coming, each one slightly larger than the last, each one accompanied by increasingly elaborate explanations. Her mother needed surgery, her brother had been in an accident, the hospital was cutting hours and her income was reduced. The stories were always plausible, always urgent, always temporary. Just until she could get back on her feet. Just until the crisis passed. Just until they could be together in person. By month 4, Robert had sent Lila over $12,000, an amount that would have shocked him if he had been keeping track. But the money flowed out in small streams rather than large rivers, each transfer feeling reasonable in isolation. A few hundred here for rent assistance, 1,000 there for her mother's medical emergency, 500 for a computer that would allow her to work from home and spend more time talking with him. The financial dependency created an intimacy that felt deeper than physical attraction. Robert became invested in every aspect of Lila's life, from her work schedules to her family dramas to her dreams for the future. She consulted him on every decision, made him feel like her partner and protector even though they had never met in person. She shared spreadsheets of her budget, showed him how his help was making the difference between survival and disaster. But Lila was masterful at manufacturing crises that required immediate solutions. Her apartment was broken into and she needed money for new locks and to replace stolen items. Her work visa was delayed and she needed funds for legal assistance. Her mother's condition worsened and the insurance wouldn't cover the necessary treatments. Each emergency felt legitimate because Lila provided documentation, photos, medical records that looked authentic to Robert's untrained eye. The emotional manipulation grew more sophisticated as their relationship deepened. Lila began having panic attacks during their video calls, crying about how alone she felt in Canada, how difficult it was to be away from family during such challenging times. She spoke of depression, of days when she couldn't get out of bed, of nights when only Robert's voice could calm her fears. She made him feel responsible for her emotional well-being, essential to her survival. Their conversations about the future became more detailed and urgent. Lila claimed she had spoken to an immigration lawyer about visiting Robert in Seattle, but the process was expensive and complicated. She would need proof of financial support, evidence of their relationship, fees for various applications and background checks. The total cost would be around $8,000, but it would allow them to finally meet in person and begin building the life they had planned together. Robert began borrowing against his retirement accounts to fund their relationship. He told himself it was a temporary loan, that he would repay the money once Lila arrived and they combined their resources. He justified the expense by comparing it to what he had spent on vacations with Sarah, on the renovations to the apartment that now felt like a monument to loss. This was an investment in his future happiness, a chance to escape the prison of grief that had held him captive for too long. The isolation that grief had created made Robert vulnerable to Lila's manipulation in ways he couldn't recognise. His social circle had shrunk to almost nothing in the months after Sarah's death. Old friends felt awkward around him, unsure how to navigate conversations that might trigger painful memories. Family gatherings felt forced and uncomfortable, everyone walking on eggshells around his grief. Lila became his primary source of emotional connection, the only person who seemed to understand his pain and offer genuine comfort. She was skilled at reading his moods through their video calls, adjusting her approach based on his emotional state. When he was depressed, she was nurturing and supportive. When he was angry about his situation, she shared his indignation and helped him feel justified in his feelings. When he was hopeful about their future, she fed that hope with detailed plans and promises. She had become his drug, and like any addict, he needed larger and larger doses to achieve the same emotional high. The warning signs were there for anyone objective enough to see them. Lila never wanted to talk during her supposed work hours at the hospital. Her knowledge of nursing seemed limited and generic. Her stories about Vancouver contained factual errors that a resident would never make. Her financial emergencies always occurred right after Robert received payments from his consulting work or withdrew money from his accounts. But love, even artificial love, creates its own reality, and Robert was living in a world where Lila's story made perfect sense. The unravelling began with a simple reverse image search that Robert almost didn't perform. He had been showing Lila's photos to his neighbour, Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had become a friend during his darkest days. Mrs. Chen had listened politely to his stories about his girlfriend in Canada, but her expression had grown increasingly concerned as the weeks passed. Finally, during a conversation about Robert's plans to bring Lila to Seattle, she had spoken up. If you're still watching this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below. Have you ever known someone who fell victim to a romance scam? How did they discover the truth? Your stories help others recognise the warning signs before it's too late. Robert, Mrs. Chen had said carefully, have you ever verified that this woman is real? These days, there are many people who use fake photos and identities to trick lonely hearts. Her words had stung because they implied that Robert was naive, desperate, easily fooled. But they had also planted a seed of doubt that grew stronger with each passing day. The image search revealed the devastating truth in seconds. The photos Lila had been sending were of a Korean model named Park Min-jung, whose professional headshots were available on dozens of websites. The intimate photos, the casual selfies, the images that had seemed so personal and spontaneous were all stolen from this woman's social media accounts and professional portfolio. The face Robert had fallen in love with belonged to someone else entirely. The discovery hit him like a physical blow, leaving him gasping for air in his empty apartment. Everything he had believed about their relationship, every emotion he had invested, every plan they had made together was built on lies. The woman he loved didn't exist. The voice on the phone belonged to a stranger, possibly a man, possibly someone in an entirely different country. The persona of Lila Santos was a carefully constructed fiction designed to separate him from his money and his sense of reality. But the worst part wasn't the financial loss, though $23,000 represented a significant portion of his savings. The worst part was the realisation of how completely he had been fooled, how desperately he had wanted to believe in something beautiful, that he had ignored every red flag. The woman he thought he loved had never existed. The future he had imagined was a fantasy built on criminal deception. Robert's first instinct was denial. Perhaps there was an innocent explanation. Maybe Lila had used someone else's photos because she was insecure about her appearance. Maybe she had reasons for deception that made sense in context. He called her immediately, his hands shaking as he dialed the number he had memorised months ago. Her reaction told him everything he needed to know. When he confronted her about the photos, Lila's voice changed. The sweet, vulnerable tone he had fallen in love with was replaced by something harder, more calculated. She claimed her phone had been hacked, that someone was trying to sabotage their relationship. She insisted the photos were really hers, that the search results were fake, that people were jealous of their happiness and trying to destroy it. But her explanations became increasingly frantic and contradictory. She couldn't explain why a Korean model's professional photos were being used to catfish lonely men on dating apps. She couldn't provide alternative photos or video evidence of her real identity. When Robert demanded to meet her in person immediately, she suddenly claimed to be hospitalized with a serious illness, unable to travel or receive visitors. The elaborate construction of lies began to collapse like a house of cards in a windstorm. Robert realized that every emergency, every crisis, every urgent need for money had been manufactured to manipulate his emotions and open his wallet. The sick mother, the visa problems, the apartment break-in, the work schedule conflicts that prevented them from meeting, all of it was fiction designed to keep him sending money while preventing any real-world verification of her identity. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything Robert had experienced in his 54 years of life. When faced with undeniable evidence of her deception, the woman who called herself Lila dropped all pretense of the sweet, vulnerable persona she had maintained for months. Her voice became cold and calculating, revealing the predator that had been hidden beneath the mask of romantic love. "You stupid old man," she said, her accent shifting to something harder, less refined than the musical Filipino cadence he had fallen in love with. "You really thought a beautiful young woman would want your pathetic old body? You were so desperate for attention you would believe anything I told you." The cruelty in her voice was like acid poured on an open wound, burning away the last vestiges of the fantasy he had constructed around their relationship. But the psychological assault was just beginning. The person behind the Lila persona had studied Robert's vulnerabilities during their months of conversation, had mapped his emotional landscape with the precision of a military strategist. Now they weaponized that knowledge against him with surgical precision. They mocked his grief over Sarah's death, called his love for his late wife pathetic clinging to a corpse. They ridiculed his loneliness, his need for companionship, his dreams of finding love again. The threats started immediately. They had recordings of their intimate video calls, screenshots of their private messages, detailed information about his financial situation and family members. If Robert tried to report the scam or recover his money, they would release everything to his children, his former colleagues, his neighbours. They would create social media accounts using his real name and photos, sharing the humiliating details of how easily he had been manipulated by a fake online girlfriend. "Your daughter Emma," the voice continued, now dripping with malicious satisfaction, "she works at that non-profit in Portland, doesn't she? Imagine how her co-workers would react to seeing Daddy's sexting sessions with his fake Asian girlfriend. And your son Michael in the army, think his commanding officers would appreciate knowing about his father's pathetic attempts to buy love from strangers on the internet?" The blackmail was comprehensive and devastating. They had gathered enough personal information during their months of conversation to destroy Robert's reputation and relationships. They knew about his financial investments, his property ownership, his medical history, his family dynamics. They had turned his openness and trust against him, transforming every intimate detail he had shared into potential ammunition for future extortion. But the cruelest twist was yet to come. The scammer revealed that Robert had not been their only victim. They operated multiple fake profiles simultaneously, conducting identical romantic scams with dozens of lonely men across North America and Europe. They shared screenshots of other conversations, other victims who had sent even larger sums of money, other men who had fallen for the same lies and manipulations that had ensnared Robert. "You want to know the really funny part?" the voice taunted. "There's a guy in Toronto who's sent me $40,000. Another one in Phoenix who's planning to leave his wife for me. You're all the same, you pathetic old men. So hungry for attention, so desperate to feel young again, that you'll believe any pretty face who tells you what you want to hear." The revelation that he was just one mark among many was somehow more devastating than the financial loss. Robert had thought his connection with Lila was special, unique, meaningful. To learn that every word, every gesture, every expression of love had been part of a mass-produced scam designed to exploit the vulnerabilities of aging men was a blow that struck at the core of his identity and self-worth. The demands began immediately. If Robert wanted to avoid public humiliation, he would need to pay $50,000 in Bitcoin within 72 hours. This would ensure his privacy and guarantee that the compromising materials would be deleted. The scammer provided detailed instructions for purchasing cryptocurrency and transferring it to an untraceable wallet. They made it clear that this was not a negotiation. It was an ultimatum with devastating consequences for non-compliance. The 72-hour deadline became a countdown to either financial ruin or public humiliation, but something had changed in Robert during that brutal phone call. The cruelty of the scammer's words, the casual way they had mocked his grief and exploited his vulnerabilities, had ignited something he thought grief had extinguished forever: anger. Pure, righteous, cleansing anger that burned away the shame and fear that had paralysed him since discovering the truth. Robert spent the first night after the ultimatum pacing his apartment like a caged animal, his mind racing through options and consequences. He could pay the $50,000 and hope the nightmare would end, but he knew enough about extortion to understand that blackmailers rarely kept their promises. More likely, this would just be the first payment in an endless series of demands that would eventually drain his retirement savings and leave him destitute. He could ignore the threats and let them publish whatever materials they wanted. But the thought of his children seeing those intimate conversations filled him with a different kind of terror. Emma was building a career in non-profit management, working with vulnerable populations who needed to trust her judgment and character. Michael was trying to rebuild his life after a difficult divorce and custody battle. A public scandal involving his father could affect his standing in the military and his relationship with his own children. But there was a third option, one that required courage Robert wasn't sure he possessed. He could fight back. He could refuse to be a victim. He could turn the tables on the predator who had tried to destroy him and help protect other potential victims from the same fate. The decision crystallised during his second sleepless night as he sat in Sarah's chair looking out at Elliott Bay and remembering the woman who had loved him for 26 years without deception or manipulation. Sarah had been a fighter, someone who faced her cancer diagnosis with determination and grace, who had refused to let the disease define her final months. She had fought for every day, every moment of happiness, every chance to leave the world a little better than she found it. Robert realised that he had been dishonouring her memory by allowing grief to make him passive and vulnerable. Sarah would not have wanted him to cower before a criminal who trafficked in loneliness and desperation. She would have expected him to stand up, fight back, and protect others from the same predator who had targeted him. The first step was documenting everything. Robert spent an entire day organising every message, every photo, every financial transaction related to the scam. He created a comprehensive timeline of the relationship, noting all the inconsistencies and red flags he had ignored in his desperation for companionship. He gathered bank records showing the steady drain of money, phone records proving the pattern of communication, and screenshots of the fake profile that had first attracted his attention. The second step was reaching out for help, something that required swallowing his pride and admitting his mistakes to people whose opinions mattered to him. He called Emma first, his hands trembling as he explained what had happened. Her reaction surprised him. Instead of judgment or pity, she expressed fierce protective anger at the criminals who had targeted her grieving father. "We're going to nail these bastards to the wall," she said, her voice carrying an echo of her mother's determination. Michael's response was even more militant. His military training had given him a deep understanding of psychological warfare and information security. "Dad, you're not the victim here anymore," he said during their video call from Germany. "You're an intelligence asset with inside knowledge of how these scams operate. We're going to use that knowledge to shut them down." Robert also reached out to Mrs. Chen, the neighbour whose gentle warning had started his investigation. She introduced him to her nephew David, a cybersecurity expert who worked for a major tech company in San Francisco. David explained that romance scams were a massive international criminal enterprise, often run by organised crime networks that operated with virtual impunity because victims were too ashamed to report them. The reason these scams work, David explained during their phone consultation, is because they exploit the victim's shame and isolation. The criminals count on you being too embarrassed to tell anyone what happened. But once you start talking about it, once you refuse to be ashamed, you take away their power. The transformation began with a simple decision to stop being ashamed. Robert called the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Centre and filed a detailed report about the romance scam, providing all the documentation he had gathered. The agent who took his statement explained that he was far from alone. Romance scams had stolen over $1 billion from American victims in the previous year, with older adults being the primary targets. Your case is actually more valuable than most, Agent Martinez explained during their follow-up interview. Most victims realise they've been scammed after sending a few hundred or maybe a few $1,000s. The fact that you maintained contact for months and documented everything gives us a much more complete picture of how these operations work. The FBI was particularly interested in the blackmail component of the scam, which elevated it from fraud to extortion and gave federal authorities additional tools for prosecution. They were also fascinated by the level of psychological manipulation the scammer had employed, which suggested a more sophisticated operation than the typical romance scam run by individual criminals. Working with federal authorities gave Robert a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life since Sarah's death. He spent hours reconstructing every detail of his interactions with the fake Lila, helping investigators understand the emotional manipulation techniques that had made the scam so effective. His architectural background proved useful in mapping out the logical structure of the deception, identifying the key pressure points and psychological triggers the scammer had exploited. But the real healing came from connecting with other victims. Agent Martinez introduced Robert to a support group for romance scam survivors, a network of mostly older adults who had experienced similar betrayals. Meeting these people shattered Robert's sense of isolation and self-blame. He discovered that the victims included retired teachers, successful business owners, former military officers, even a retired judge, people whose intelligence and life experience should have protected them from such obvious deception. The scammers don't target stupid people, explained Dr. Patricia Wong, a psychologist who specialised in financial fraud victims. They target emotionally vulnerable people, and grief makes everyone vulnerable. They study their marks for weeks or months, learning exactly which buttons to push to override rational thinking. What happened to you has nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with human nature. Robert began volunteering with the support group, sharing his story at community centres and senior organisations. Speaking publicly about his experience was terrifying at first, but he discovered that his honesty gave others permission to share their own stories. He helped several other victims report their cases to authorities and connected them with resources for financial and emotional recovery. The investigation into his scammer proved more successful than Robert had dared hope. The detailed information he had provided, combined with similar reports from other victims, allowed federal authorities to trace the operation to a criminal organisation based in Lagos, Nigeria. Working with international law enforcement partners, they were able to identify and arrest several key figures in the network. More importantly, the investigation led to the shutdown of dozens of fake dating profiles and the recovery of hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen money. While Robert never recovered his $23,000, knowing that his cooperation had prevented other victims from losing their life savings gave him a sense of satisfaction that surprised him with its intensity. The criminal who had impersonated Lila was eventually identified as part of a larger network that specialised in targeting recently widowed men through dating apps and social media. The sophistication of their operation was staggering. They maintained detailed databases of potential victims, complete with psychological profiles and financial assessments. They used artificial intelligence to help craft personalised messages and employed professional writers to create believable backstories for their fake personas. 8 months after discovering the truth about Lila, Robert Matthews stood in his apartment looking out at Elliott Bay and realised that something fundamental had changed. The view was the same, the memories were still there, but the crushing weight of isolation had lifted. The experience of being victimised had paradoxically made him feel more connected to humanity than he had since Sarah's death. His work with romance scam victims had evolved into a second career that gave his life new meaning and purpose. He had partnered with the FBI to create educational materials for older adults about online safety, and his presentations at community centres were always packed with people eager to learn how to protect themselves and their loved ones. His architect's mind had proven excellent at designing systems and processes to help organisations identify and prevent fraud. The relationship with his children had deepened through the crisis. Emma visited more frequently, and their conversations had moved beyond careful check-ins to genuine discussions about life, loss, and resilience. Michael's deployment would end in 3 months, and he was planning to move to Seattle to be closer to his father and help with the anti-fraud work that had become Robert's passion. But perhaps the most important change was internal. Robert had learned to distinguish between loneliness and solitude, between being alone and being lonely. The desperate hunger for connection that had made him vulnerable to the scammer had been replaced by a more mature understanding of what healthy relationships required. He was dating again, but cautiously, with the wisdom earned through hard experience. He had met Carol at a grief support group meeting where he had been speaking about financial fraud. She was a retired nurse whose husband had died 2 years earlier, a woman with her own scars and her own hard-won wisdom about loss and recovery. Their relationship was developing slowly, built on shared interests and genuine compatibility rather than the desperate neediness that had made him an easy target for criminals. The difference, he explained to a group of recent scam victims during one of his presentations, is that real love doesn't require you to prove your worthiness through financial sacrifice. Real love doesn't manufacture crises that only money can solve. Real love doesn't make you feel ashamed of your vulnerability. It honours that vulnerability and protects it. The apartment no longer felt like a museum of loss. Robert had finally removed some of Sarah's belongings, not because he loved her less, but because he understood that honouring her memory meant living fully rather than merely existing. He had redecorated the bedroom, started cooking again, even bought a new coffee mug to replace the one that had become a symbol of his grief. The scammer's threats had never materialised. Like most criminals, they had moved on to easier targets once Robert refused to pay the extortion demands. The FBI had provided him with tools to monitor his online presence and protect his personal information, and the support group had taught him that shame was the scammer's most powerful weapon. Once he stopped being ashamed, they lost their power over him. His story had been featured in several news articles and documentaries about romance scams, and each time it was published, Robert received messages from other victims thanking him for his courage in speaking publicly. Many of them went on to report their own cases to authorities, creating a ripple effect that helped law enforcement build stronger cases against the criminal networks that preyed on vulnerable adults. The lesson Robert wanted to share with everyone watching was simple but profound. Loneliness makes us vulnerable, but vulnerability is not weakness. It's humanity. The criminals who run romance scams understand human nature better than most of us understand ourselves. They know that the desire for connection, for love, for companionship is so fundamental to human nature that it can override even sophisticated intelligence and life experience. But knowledge is power, and community is protection. The more we talk about these scams, the more we share our stories without shame, the harder it becomes for criminals to operate in the shadows. Every person who speaks up, every victim who reports their case, every survivor who warns others about the dangers lurking in digital spaces makes the online world a little safer for everyone. If you're watching this story and you recognise yourself in Robert's experience, know that you're not alone and you're not stupid. You're human, and that's not something to be ashamed of. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that shine light on the truth behind online deception. Leave a comment sharing your own experiences or thoughts. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to protect themselves or begin their own healing journey. And remember to stay vigilant online, because the best defense against these predators is an informed and connected community that refuses to let anyone suffer in silence. The greatest victory over the criminals who traffic in loneliness is a life lived with courage, connection, and hope. Robert Matthews had found all three, and in doing so, he had transformed from victim to survivor to protector of others. Sarah would have